and to talk and to listen and to share and to encourage one another. And we basically had 4 events in each of those categories, 4 public speakers and 4 events where we talk together. And the reason is very simple, and it's the same reason that you're all on the Zoom tonight, and that is that mental health as an issue is exploding across America as an urgent crisis and impacting the lives of millions of families and taking the lives of people that we love and treasure. Magazine that I get at the house is called The Week, and a recent cover issue was titled Epidemic of Anguish, the epidemic of anguish. And the inside article primarily featured on the mental health crisis among young women. But, even in our 1 year with our Shalom ministry, we've seen that it covers every imaginable age, every gender. Shalom itself means the fullness of well-being. It's not simply the word peace, which is how we often think of it, but actually the fullness of well-being, and that's what we wish for one another. And tonight we have Philip Schermer with us, and when Julie Johnson and Kathy O'Donnell and I were first putting together this concept of Shalom, Philip was the first professional person in the field to talk with us, and gave us about an hour and a half of his time and gave us guidance and encouragement and inspiration. And I want to thank you for that, Philip. Philip Schermer is the founder and CEO of Project Healthy Minds, a millennial Generation Z-driven nonprofit startup focused on tackling one of the defining issues of this generation, the growing mental health crisis. I'm quoting from the website. And one of the statistics that are cited on the website is that it's 10 years on average from the onset of mental health symptoms to effective care. And that may be one of the driving forces behind Project Healthy Minds. And on the next paragraph, which I found fascinating from the website, where they write, Project Healthy Minds is building the world's first digital mental health marketplace to democratize access to life-changing services, partnering with public figures to destigmatize mental health, and creating the first national standards for businesses to better support employee mental health. I've developed 4 questions before we take it to the group to kind of guide our discussion tonight. And the first question, Philip, if you would tell us your own journey from a student at the University of Michigan to a wildly successful and diverse career in finance and marketing and technology and music and movies, with a major career in finance at BlackRock, and now devoting your life and your career and your gifts, and I would dare say your calling, to mental health. Tell us about your journey.
Well, thank you, David and Alita and Julie, for having me and for spearheading this really important work. I'm excited for the conversation tonight, and folks should feel free to jump in and ask me questions whenever. I'm not precious. Look, I spent the last 8 years at BlackRock. I was the chief of staff to the vice chairman and then to the global CMO, and worked on all kinds of issues when I was at the firm, from built 2 fintech products, worked on the substance of what BlackRock CEO Larry Fink writes about every year in his annual CEO letter about companies serving all stakeholders, not only shareholders. What does that really mean in today's world? I mean, how does a management team actually serve all of its stakeholders, the employees that work for the company, the customers they're supposed to be serving, the communities in which they operate in? There's a whole body of work around that, and worked on a lot of our early days social impact work and sustainable investing work as a firm. So that's sort of what the last 8.5 years looked like for me. I had taken time off college. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I went to college at the University of Michigan, and I took time off college to work in the Obama White House on the economic policy team and remained pretty involved in those circles. And then I went to BlackRock, spent a long time at BlackRock, and then crazy enough left 8 months ago to go full-time on Project Healthy Minds. But the story of how we got there. And David, I hope I'm not front running your next question, but maybe I'll just get right into it, is the work that we're doing now. So I guess the other piece of context that everybody should know, because you'll ask yourself, if you've worked in finance, what the heck is this music connection? Why is there music that's part of your origin story? It doesn't make any sense to me. So let me just contextualize. When I was in college, I had started a nonprofit that was, we took a music tech arts festival and we combined it with a nonprofit incubator. So use the money from the festival to seed fund nonprofit startups. Because when I went to college in the fall of 2010, I was like, I want to be Mark Zuckerberg, but for a nonprofit. And a university, and this is why Mark Zuckerberg was very cool. And I felt then, as I do now, that universities have all the ingredients to help to build an incubator, and to help build an incubator for new ideas in the nonprofit space. You have subject matter experts across every subject area in the faculty. At Michigan, you have 500,000 living alumni. You have these idealistic young students with new ideas and a lot of free time. You have the curricular, the co-curricular. And so I thought, well, it had all the ingredients, and yet the university at the time was unsure what an incubator really meant and how to implement it, and whether it was important. So the idea was, okay, well, we'll fund it ourselves via a music tech arts festival. So that's just the backstory to understand where this music piece comes from. So basically, about 4 years ago, I was at breakfast with two friends of mine in New York who manage a bunch of well-known musicians. And they told me a story over breakfast that inspired the creation of Project Healthy Minds. And that story is, one of their artists is a hip hop artist by the name of Logic. And Logic released a song in April of 2017. The title of the song is the phone number of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the 1-800 number. It's now 988, but for decades was the 1-800 number. And the song was about Logic's own struggle with depression, which is rooted in the fact that he's biracial. And so, like a lot of kids who grow up biracial in America, he struggled with a sense of identity and belonging. Black kids didn't consider him Black. White kids didn't consider him white. He never fit in, and it fueled his own mental health journey. So the song was him coming out about his own mental health journey. And it was actually the first song that he wrote when he gave up trying to write a radio hit. Logic is part of, there's a group of 4 artists, hip hop artists, who all came up at the same time. Chance the Rapper, Kendrick Lamar, Logic, and Mac Miller, that you may not have heard that much about, or for a long time you didn't hear much about, but all of them became famous because they were the first crop of artists to build their audiences, not through traditional radio play, but through digital, basically through YouTube. And so all 4 of them were selling out gigantic venues, making a ton of money, but they had gigantic fan bases, skewing very young, these kids who would buy merch, and they'd show up to 3 shows a year, and but none of the 4 of them were getting played on the radio because they hadn't gone down that path. They were charting their own path. So Logic was extremely successful, selling out back-to-back nights of Terminal 5 in New York on his road to selling out Madison Square Garden, but he didn't have a radio. The average person in America probably had not heard of Logic's name before, couldn't name his music. And so for years, he had been trying to write a radio hit, but nothing had worked. Finally, he gave up. He said, clearly it's not for me. I'm doing extremely well. I'm just going to write what I care about. So instead, he wrote what he thought would be an artsy song, which was about his own mental health journey, him coming out. Well, that song went 7 times platinum and was nominated for 2 Grammys, Song of the Year and Music Video of the Year. It was the most played song in America in 2017. And so I knew the song well as a fan of Logic, as a friend of his managers, just trying to support them on all their artist new music. What I didn't know, what I learned over this breakfast, was the day that song was released in April of 2017, the suicide hotline saw the 2nd highest call volume in its history, behind the death of Robin Williams. A few months later, he performs that song at the MTV Video Music Awards. There's a 50% spike in call volume to the hotline. A few months after that, he performs it as the closing set at the Grammys in 2018. There's a 300% spike in call volume to the hotline. And then when we hit the 1-year mark of the song release, so April of 2018, the hotline published a report showing that call volume was up 30% year over year since the day the song had been released. And then there was a study that was published in the British Medical Journal showing it wasn't just an increase in call volume, it led to a significant number of lives saved because people were calling and asking for help. So Chris and Harry, the managers, tell me the story. And because of my background in tech and marketing, the way that I heard them describe the story was that the song was acting like a marketing tactic for the hotline, right? And as interesting as the spikes were, what was actually much more interesting to me was the fact that it was sustained over the course of a full year, because that's very unusual in marketing and tech. And when something is sustained over the course of a full year, what it means is the increase in call volume or whatever it is isn't about the novelty of the marketing tactic. It means it's speaking to something core about the human experience if it's durable over the course of a full year. And I felt then, I'm 31 now, I felt then as I do now that there is this pervasive generational loneliness for everyone that I know. And, you know, most people my age, they'll never say, they won't say to you, I'm lonely, I'm depressed. They certainly won't say it in the present tense. In the best case scenario, they'll tell you that at some point in the past, they dealt with something, but they came out the other side and don't worry, I'm fine now. But instead, what most people I know my age use is they just use coded language. They talk about being really burned out at work. They talk about hating the dating scene in New York City or in Chicago or wherever they are. They talk about, they reminisce sort of wistfully about when they were in college and when they had all these friends around them and they were meeting all these people. And, you know, and so they never say outright, like, I'm lonely, I'm depressed. But if you really listen to what they're saying, that's what they're talking about. And it didn't matter. You could be in finance, you could be in advertising, fashion, or tech, working in the Valley or entertainment in LA. It didn't really matter what industry you were in. It was 99% of the people I knew. And so it was in that context that Chris and Harry told me the story. And basically my spidey sense went off. I was like, there is no way that everyone my age is talking about mental health. And the #1 song in America, the title of the song is the phone number of the suicide hotline, and it's a hip hop song. And that those two things aren't related. Of course, those two things have to be related. And so I basically came off the breakfast and I was like, okay, you know, I'll be honest in saying I only knew the issue of mental health through a personal lens and a social lens, like most Americans do. I had never studied it as a macroeconomic or public health issue. But my view was, because of my policy background, I could go study this issue like I've studied any other policy issue. So I went on this long research journey. And what I basically found is you've got 615 million people worldwide with a mental health condition, 65 million Americans. That's 4 times the number of people diagnosed with cancer in America. Despite that prevalence, 60% of people, 6 in 10 in America, never get any form of mental health care. And there's 3 primary drivers why. All the literature, all the research shows there's 3 drivers. One is the stigma, right? People aren't comfortable asking for help, talking about help, learning. The second is people don't know where to go to get help. You have a huge discoverability issue in this country. And so people put it off. They don't know if you've ever tried to find a therapist or any kind of mental health help, whatever kind it is, you know, it takes forever. And so in a world where most people are used to, you know, 4 clicks and an Uber shows up, 5 clicks, and the next day they're getting something from Amazon. If it takes 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to find a therapist or to find the right kind of mental health care, or you don't know what the difference is between a therapist and a psychiatrist and a psychologist, all these terms feel confusing and overlapping, then you just put it off. You say, okay, I'm going to deal with this tomorrow. But tomorrow becomes next week, next month, next year. And that's why on average in the United States, the average amount of time between when people start exhibiting mental health symptoms and when they get help the first time is more than 10 years. So the second driver is people don't know where to go to get help. And the third driver is the cost of care, which is rooted in the fact that we don't have enough providers in the country and health insurance doesn't cover what it needs to. And the combination of those things makes the cost of care very high. Okay, took a step back and I was looking at the first 2 causes of the gap: stigma and the fact that it's hard to find help. And I thought about it in the context of Logic Song, and it made me realize that Logic Song was actually this unbelievable public health case study for how you close the treatment gap, because you had a 28-year-old hip hop star who was effectively coming out of the closet about his own mental health journey, creating the permission structure for others to do the same, destigmatizing the issue. And the title of the song was the phone number for where you could access mental health care services, which, to the second cause of the gap, people don't know where to go to get help. And the key was, when those two things were done in tandem, you saw skyrocketing rates of help-seeking behavior, people calling the hotline and asking for help. That was the durable mechanic. And so realized at that point that that could be scaled. That didn't need to be just a song. And so I started with a landscape analysis looking at stigma, because as I said, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and my parents are very worldly and progressive minded and warm. And I mean, I grew up in as nice and kind of a home as you could possibly grow up in, but I didn't remember anything growing up in Pittsburgh about mental health. And I was like, I don't know if I'm the exception or the rule in this country. Maybe I'm the exception because I grew up in Pittsburgh. Maybe if you grew up in New York or LA, it would be different. So I started with a landscape analysis to understand, well, what's happened on mental health in this country from a destigmatization perspective. And what you basically find is work falls into two camps. One, you either have celebrities who come out about their own mental health journey, which is great, but it's usually temporal. It's in the press for a day, maybe two, and then it goes away. So there's no call to action. There's no longevity to it. So you look at it and you're like, okay, this is really impactful, but what would be even more impactful if it was not just in the press for one day. On the other hand, you have these mental health nonprofits, and the mental health nonprofits are severely underfunded. Their core competencies are clinical in nature, right? They do scientific research, they provide free clinical services. And so when you see these kinds of organizations try to take on changing public attitudes around mental health, it's really well-intentioned work, but it's not necessarily the most sophisticated marketing communications in the world, because their core competencies of those organizations is not influencer strategy and social media and content creation and technology. They're clinicians. That's their core competency. And so it was clear there was this white space that if you could go recruit private sector quality marketing communications experts, you could do something way more sophisticated on stigma, because the reality is changing public attitudes about a health topic is the same exercise as changing public attitudes about a brand. It's the same thing. And there's just a level of sophistication that's table stakes in the private sector at any big brand. BlackRock, American Express, Nike, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, any direct-to-consumer e-commerce startup that was just not being applied in the space. And at the same time, what I knew from doing 12 years of music work was with some of the biggest hip hop artists in the country was there's no health issue more prevalent among musicians than the issue of mental health. And that's true, frankly, of all of Hollywood and the whole creative class. It's double the rate of the general public in the music community. So it's 1 in 4 Americans, and it's every other musician in the country. And so what you had was a group of people who were disproportionately impacted by mental health, but also who shape popular culture and can bring issues out of the shadows by the nature of their art, whatever it is. And so realized there was this white space. If you could marry world-class marketing communications from the private sector with culture makers at scale, musicians, actors, actresses, athletes, comedians, YouTubers, TikTokers, you could do something really interesting on stigma. So then the question becomes, okay, what's the call to action? Because in that moment when somebody sees a role model that they look up to, an aspirational role model coming out and talking about their own mental health journey, people are inspired in that moment to take action for themselves. And so you either need a call to action or you're going to miss the moment. And so the question was, okay, how do we recreate that? And so I just quick show of hands, I'd be curious, how many of you have ever used OpenTable or Resi or Expedia or kayak.com or Priceline, cheap tickets, any of those? Okay. Those are all aggregators. They're all discovery marketplaces, right? Amazon, same thing. The idea was to take the aggregator discovery marketplace model that's common in every other part of our life and reapply it to the discovery of mental health services, but across the whole spectrum of mental health services, from the subclinical, like meditation, to therapy, to medication, psychiatry, to inpatient, peer-to-peer support groups, crisis lines. The idea is whether you want a digital mental health tool or you want a traditional in-person experience, there should be one front door on the internet for finding mental health services, vetted by clinicians, but free for the public to use. And if you do that, then every time you partner with a public figure, whether it is a musician, an actor, an athlete, a business leader, a political leader, but whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. There's one call to action. There's one website you drive people to. It doesn't matter what zip code you live in, what your mental health needs are, if you have insurance, if you don't have insurance, what kind of insurance, race, ethnicity, any of the things that inform your mental health journey, you should be able to find mental health services. It's morally egregious that in 2023, it's easier to book a flight, a hotel, or a restaurant reservation than it is to find mental health services. And so that's basically how we came to start Project Healthy Mind. So it's basically a tech company, but it's in a 501c3 not-for-profit, trying to use technology to solve a social issue.
I love your website, by the way, and I would recommend everybody check it out as soon as possible. It is inviting and it is easy to navigate even for a Luddite like myself. And just to highlight two examples, one section is called Browse by Emotional State, which is exactly what it sounds like. It lists 8 or 10 different ways that you might be feeling, and depending on what they are, you just click onto that and it takes you deeper into it. And then the other one is called Browse by Resource Type. What is it that you're looking for? What is it that you're interested in? And again, it covers the top 8 or 10 that any of us would think of. So that leads to this question, Philip. In our experience, one of the biggest challenges is, how do you bring someone to an awareness of needing help and then accepting help? You know, whether it's therapy or medication or any other things that you cite there, there's a huge gap between seeing that there's a problem and agreeing to get help. How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think a huge part of this, I think if you look at the history of the country, representation among our role models has played a key role in how the public understands all kinds of issues. So I'll take you back on a history lesson. So before my time, Betty Ford, 1974, had breast cancer, came out about getting a mastectomy at a time, which I didn't even know. I mean, I was born in 91. I didn't even realize that when my parents were growing up, cancer was called the big C. People did not want to admit that they had cancer. If you look back and study Betty Ford, what you see is after she came out about her mastectomy, breast cancer screening rates in the country increased by more than 1,000%. And you can draw a line from Betty Ford, 1974, to, do you guys remember when Katie Couric got her colonoscopy live on air at the height of the Today Show in March of 2000 after she lost her husband? Scientists after that then coined the term the Katie Couric effect because it led to a statistically significant increase in the number of people getting colonoscopies that has maintained even to this day. You can draw a line from Betty Ford, 1974, on breast cancer, to Magic Johnson on HIV/AIDS, to Katie Couric, all the way through. And so part of it, big, to get to the question that you're asking, I mean, I don't think there is one magical answer, but I do think one of the things that we see over and over is that when role models share their story, it inspires people to take action, because when they see themselves in the story of someone they look up to, that they admire, that they think is successful, then they don't feel as stigmatized. Like if Carson Daly has panic attacks, and he's been one of the most famous broadcast TV hosts of the last 20 years, from TRL on MTV, Total Request Live, to the Today Show today. If he can succeed being on air every day while having panic attacks, then surely I can too. And so part of it is about, from my perspective, is having role models for every kind of community across I mean, not everybody is going to be motivated by Lady Gaga or by Chance the Rapper or by Carson Daly. So you need role models that represent every community. It's also why you need business leaders. Like, the reality is, there's a lot of people who live in Connecticut who are business leaders that a lot of people look up to. And in many respects, them talking about mental health, whether it's their own journey, someone in their family, someone they love, has a profound impact on how people view the issue, how everybody else views the issue. And in many respects, that's equally or more important than Lady Gaga doing it for the 100th time. So one part is about the role models. The other part is the kind of stories that we tell. We did a history. One of the things we looked at was this is right before the pandemic, we did a landscape analysis, and we looked at how mental health nonprofits portray visually mental health. And so we started with photography. We looked at photography styles. And one of the things you find when you look at mental health nonprofits and hospitals and whatever is you find a couple things. First of all, there's a lot of stock photography, which just stinks. But more importantly, the most common image that you oftentimes see is like the kid in a dark room with his head in his hands, like he's suicidal, right? And the problem with that approach is that what you're portraying is the most extreme version of mental health that feels violent and dangerous, right? Either dangerous to the kid, dangerous to somebody else. And the reality is there's 47,000 suicides each year in the United States. There's 65 million Americans with a mental health condition. If you really are serious about reducing suicide in the country, like all things in healthcare, you need to be focusing more on prevention as opposed to only focusing on the acute crisis moment. And so even how we think about the stories that we tell and how we portray the journey, like that people can have ups and downs in their lives, but the key thing is that they were down, but there was a turning point and they did something or they learned something that made them reach out to get help. And now they've had a huge success. Those are the kinds of stories we need to tell, not only the tragic stories. If all people here, if all young people here growing up are stories of tragedy and all they see are portrayals that feel scary and dangerous, then the image that's formed in most people's minds around what mental health is feels stigmatized and taboo because it's scary and dangerous, and you don't feel comfortable identifying with it.
I think you've already answered my third question about that marvelous paragraph where you talked about wanting to be the first mental health marketplace. I think you've described that very well, and some of our people on the Zoom may want to come back to that in a moment. So let me go to one more question and then we'll open it up. Even in our little church and in this new Shalom ministry, we have the full breadth and depth of mental health crises, every single one that I can think of, experienced within our church family. And when we meet with the individuals who are in crisis, or when we talk with the families and friends of those who are in crisis, the overwhelming reality that we come up against is frustration and confusion and despair and even anger about that, in terms of how to deal with it, how to access it, all the things you've already been talking about tonight and that your marketplace is trying to solve. So in contrast to that, what would you say are the good news and the good signs out there? I heard recently that investment capital is pouring in to mental health in ways that it never did before. So I would look to that as a good sign. And we have some young people in our church who are seniors in high school, freshmen, sophomores in college, who want to become therapists. And I've told them, they're in the pipeline. there is a concern to make sure they're able to achieve that goal and that it be affordable for them. What are the other good news and good signs out there that you're aware of?
Well, I'll tell you what the biggest what in finance they would say what is the biggest tailwind that will help moving forward, which is I actually think, I mean, COVID was terrible in so many ways. But if there is one silver lining or there's a lesson, I mean, there's many lessons to come out of COVID, but if there's one thing that is meaningful for mental health, we just engaged in a gigantic social experiment in social isolation. And, you know, it's funny, I remember we had we had a board meeting April 29th of 2020. So a month and a half after everyone went into lockdown. And I remember somebody on the board, it was like our second board meeting, and somebody on the board asked me, what does all this mean for Project Healthy Minds? And I was like, I'm sorry, have all of you lived through once in a lifetime pandemics? There's no playbook for this. But what I said then, I believe now to be the case, which is when everybody is into forced isolation, regardless of what your views were of mental health before the pandemic, like you could not escape the concept of mental health, your own mental health, your family's mental health, your friends' mental health, when you went through COVID. And one of the things that in particular I've seen and heard a lot, because I've talked to a lot of parents, is I think that a lot of parents, when they were forced to work from home and their kids weren't going to school, they had much greater visibility into the lives of their kids in profound ways that they had never understood before. And so I think a lot of parents knew that their kids were more willing to talk about mental health than when they grew up, felt like it was a bigger issue among this younger generation. But when they were locked at home, they came to learn the details of it to a much more profound degree. And seeing that, I think, is one of the most important long-term things that can possibly happen, because what you've had historically for decades for mental health in this country is people averting their gaze, right? That's really how the stigma manifests, is that people just look away. They don't want to acknowledge what's actually in their family, what people they love, friends are all dealing with. And when you're forced to see it and see it every day and see it in your kids, experience it yourself, suddenly you have a newfound appreciation for the importance of the issue. It doesn't mean that you're going to be running around telling the whole world about your own mental health journey or your kid's mental health journey, but it does mean that you're way more tuned into it. And if you don't believe me, then I'll cite an Axios story, an Axios report that came out 2 weeks ago, which showed there was a poll, an Ipsos Axios poll, that surveyed parents who have kids in school. I think it's elementary, middle, and high school. And the number one issue, they asked, what are the issues, the most important issues that are facing kids these days that the parents are worried about? And the number one issue that parents identify that they're worried about is mental health. That would have never happened a decade ago. And so to me, that is the tailwind, is that everybody, it doesn't matter what you came in, what your views were before COVID, everybody's coming out of COVID focused on it in a much more profound way. And the question is now, how does that manifest itself? How does that manifest itself in terms of public policy changes, in terms of changes in the workplace, in terms of changes in school systems, in terms of changes in higher education? That's the question, is how do we translate greater awareness and recognition that it's an issue and that we need new solutions to it into institutional change?
I think what you're touching upon is the same reason that Shalom came into being, which was the recognition that this is not a passing fad or trend until the next big thing comes along.
Right.
And certainly agree with you that there's a level of conversation and awareness and sensitivity in the last 18 months to 2 years than anything I've ever seen in my life. And I also love what you had to say before about, in terms of destigmatization and looking for new images. There's a brand new album coming out of Pierce Fulton's music. It just came out this week. And it has the most beautiful and inspiring cover art that I could possibly imagine. And the decision to link this last music of Pierce's with this explosively beautiful piece of art is a powerful statement from his friends and family. And I think that's what we want to be a part of. We're going to close now the actual recording of what we've been doing for the last 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up to questions from anyone on the Zoom that would like to ask a question of Philip. So Alita, I'm going to just say, have you ended the recording? And it's just anecdotal, but we have found in our ministry here at the church that our younger generation, say the 14 through 24-year-olds, when they open up to their peer groups, that they are on medication, they're going to a therapist, this is what I'm dealing with, all those sorts of things. They're finding much more support and encouragement from their peers than the generations above that. And that generation is much more willing to speak about it, and they're finding much more acceptance among their peers. So I look to that, and maybe that's an outgrowth of COVID as well, because they're the generation that been so impacted. But I see that as a good news story, even was the one that you just told about McCormick. Oh my goodness! I mean, that just gives you chills that we're still at that stage.
Yeah.
Philip, thank you for tonight. What a blessing you are in the world, but what a blessing you are to our group tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. I think that the fact that the Shalom Ministry exists is a sign of the times, and we need more of that.
We'll keep at it, and you will, and we'll keep pushing people to your website.
Okay. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out.
All righty.
Thanks so much, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night all. God bless you.